Well, it is Friday now, and so we are going to turn our attention to Friday of the week that Christians across the world remember as the Passion Week. And over the years, this day has come to be known as Good Friday. And it is all of that, but on the other hand, this day, that is the day which we remember on this day, the day that happened on April 3rd of 33 AD by my lights, that day was at once the most awful and the most blessed day in all of human history. It was the most awful because the greatest travesty of justice, the greatest miscarriage of all that is holy, was perpetrated on that day when the perfect, sinless Son of Man, Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ, was crucified. On the other hand, it is the most blessed of any day in all of human history because of what was wrought on our behalf on that blessed day. And so we are going to turn our thoughts to that day. So welcome to session number 10. Now I'm going to take a moment because I had some glitches along the way, and I want to make sure that I am live and public. That's what I've got here, so I trust it is working. But I don't, there's no production staff here, let's say it that way, and so I have to kind of watch over these things while I go. Forgive me for that. And I want to make a bit of an announcement with all of this clunky beginning. Listen, we have so much to handle on this day, and it's so important. What's before us in terms of the biblical record is basically, number one, the arrest and the trials. Jesus arrested outside of Gethsemane, outside that garden, and that garden, which is in point of fact a farm. And then he is taken, first of all, to the Jewish Sanhedrin, and there is a series of hearings before the Sanhedrin through the night. And then very, very early on Friday morning, about 4:30, we'll talk about that, he is taken to Pilate, and there he is tried before Pilate. And there are a number of events connected with that recorded in Scripture. And then, so we have the arrest and the trials, and then, of course, we have the absolutely sublime consideration of the crucifixion and the burial. Now, all that on this day, and quite frankly, I think the story needs to be fully told. And in order to have time for that, I'm going to do 2 lessons today. So we're going to begin today with the arrest and the trials, and then I'm going to take a break and I'm going to return and I'll announce the time. Now listen, I know that this is way too much to ask. This is a bridge way too far on any day. So most of you won't be able to be with me for that second session, but I wanted to get it done today. And so with all the busyness of the day, and then of course, most of us are going to be attending online services today and so on. So again, if fortune smiles on me and providence is good, the recordings will be there, and perhaps sometime as if the Spirit compels you so to do, you can view the lesson as the day allows. So with that background, again, we are going to begin this morning with a consideration of the arrest and the trials. Now, let me take you. I have to hold on here now. I have to go here. Let me take you to now. I've sharing has, I said in my note yesterday, has always been a problem for me, and so it still is, as it were. But here we are, and this is the outline that we've been using. I got to get my head together here, and let me just rehearse it very quickly because I hope this isn't overly pedantic, but honest to goodness, I have stressed from the very beginning that it's so important to understand this entire week as an unfolding drama, not just a series of unrelated pericopes or events, but an unfolding drama, everything flowing into what comes next. And so here is sort of a very brief overview. Sunday, again, a day of messianic presentation. The reference there is to the Triumphal Entry. And the Triumphal Entry on Sunday morning, it was not an accident. It wasn't, it was carefully orchestrated by our Lord. He had planned in such a way, he had planned his trip to Jerusalem for the Passover that year. He had timed it and planned it in such a way that he alerted the city to his coming. Matter of fact, on Friday, the city began to hear that, as John 12:12 says, the Messiah is coming. And then on Sunday morning, the whole city came out to meet him and erupted in excited, happy welcome and so on. And that was the carefully prophesied moment of official offer by Jesus of himself as Messiah. He is presenting himself as Messiah. Whether there are other typological issues at stake, I'm not sure, as far as presenting himself as the Lamb. That could be. But what's clear in the record is that he is presenting himself as Messiah. And then we ask this question, given Sunday, why Friday? And I want to talk about that for just a little bit, even here. But this is the answer that we suggested. I think the answer is Monday and Tuesday. Again, if the question before the House is given Sunday, why Friday? That is, given the fact that on Sunday they have excitedly, the city welcomes him with such excitement, why on Friday are they crying for his crucifixion? That's where we're headed. I think the answer is Monday and Tuesday. And we made this point that throughout his ministry, Jesus had a remarkable, he had developed a strategy of testing what seemed to be the willingness of people to follow him. And he would simply put his finger on a raw spiritual nerve. And we saw this in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus demands that the people put distance, that is, he puts distance between himself and the Pharisees and demands that the people make a choice. Now, I think that's what's going on Monday and Tuesday. When Jesus, first of all, cleanses the temple, possesses it, the messenger of the new covenant comes suddenly to his temple. He behaves more messianically than ever else in his ministry for 2 exciting days. He puts to silence all of his enemies in open debate. He argues from the scriptures themselves that his messiahship is legitimate. But as he leaves the Temple Mount on Tuesday afternoon, he pronounces a series of absolutely excoriating, withering curses and woes upon specifically and exclusively the scribes and the Pharisees. And we have the pattern of Matthew 5-7. And I believe that what Jesus is doing again, just as he did in the Sermon on the Mount, he is saying, you make a choice. You're not going to have me on your terms. You'd like me to deliver you from Rome, but you're confident that you can deliver yourself from whatever there is of a sin judgment because the Pharisees have taught you that you can enter the kingdom by keeping the law. And Jesus is saying it's wrong. And you've got to make a choice. Now, I think that is the answer to given Sunday, why Friday. But I want to qualify because I've had a little bit of pushback, and forgive me for taking too much time on this, I trust, but I'm going to take you to a couple of scriptures. I trust I have the scriptures in front of you. I think I'm doing this right. Hold on here. So I've had some very, very worthy and kind and gracious and meaningful replies. Honest to goodness, I appreciate it very much. With people saying, well, are you overdoing the fickleness of the Jewish people? Did they all abandon him? Were there none who were genuine followers? Well, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. And I'm struggling to make sure I'm doing this right, but I guess I'm just going to assume that it's working. So I am sharing. Hold on here now. I am sharing the scriptures. So I think that's what's in front of you. But at any rate, let me take you to a couple of scriptures. All right. This is all live. Folks, listen, no, I'm not saying that there were none of the people clearly. There were many who did believe on him. But the leadership, the Sanhedrin leadership, and there was a believing remnant in the Sanhedrin. At least two of them, Joseph and Nicodemus. So if Nicodemus was indeed, if we take it as one of the rulers, and I think he was. So the point is that I don't want to overstate it, but I think the fact is that I don't want to understate it either. And sometimes the argument is made that it was just the leaders, or sometimes that it wasn't the people who welcomed him on Sunday. It was a later crowd. But okay, maybe other people came to the city who weren't there, but the city did welcome him as king. And the argument that I hear all the time is, well, if you look in the record, it says that the people listened to him gladly, that they counted him a prophet. Yes, but that's all on Monday and Tuesday. That's my point, that they were clearly following him. It doesn't say they embraced him in faith. It says they thought it was a prophet, and they were excited about him, and they were excited when he cleansed the temple. Amen and amen. But that's the point. I don't like the term fickle, to be honest with you, because it's a little shallower than I think what's at stake here. But the point is simply this, that the people, I think, were genuinely excited on Sunday about receiving Jesus because they thought of him as a deliverer from Rome. And when Jesus, again, by putting distance between himself and the Pharisees, made this point, that's not enough, the people began to ponder it. And folks, this is the spiritual reality of every age, of our own age. Is it not true that as you share the gospel, if you talk about Jesus with people, you might be willing to accept him as a good teacher and all this sort of stuff. But when you get down and dirty, okay, and you realize that your only hope for eternal life is to entrust yourself to what he's done on your behalf. You can't trust in what you do. That's where it becomes offensive. So this is a dynamic that pervades, the moral universe, if you don't mind. But let me take you to a couple of scriptures, because the question before the house, just briefly, and I probably shouldn't spend this much time, but the question before the house is, who is responsible for Jesus? That's going to sound terrible. Were the people? Was it just the leaders, or were the people involved? And again, let me take Acts 2 and verse 22. This is on the day of Pentecost, and Peter is preaching, and I just want one phrase out of it. He says, "Men of Israel." I have it here in orange. Men of Israel. So he's talking not just to the leaders. Hear these words. And then he talks about Jesus, him being delivered up by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God. Amen and amen. This was all in the purpose of God. Amen. But he says, you have taken, men of Israel, you have taken. Again, if we jump forward to Acts chapter 3, and here is Peter at Solomon's porch. And of course, he has healed a man. He and John have healed a man who was lame. And so he comes, and notice what he says here, beginning in verse 12. He says, so when Peter saw it, the people began to come. This isn't just the leaders. These are the people. And he says, men of Israel, why do you marvel at this miracle? And so on. Drop down here. He says, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the God of our fathers glorified his servant Jesus. Now listen, whom you delivered up and denied in the presence of Pilate when he was determined to let him go. But you denied. He's talking to the masses, the Holy One and the Just, and asked for a murder, and you again killed the Prince of Light. Now he's laying at the charge of that generation. And he goes on to say, yet now I know that you did in ignorance. I want to come back to this, brethren, but he's talking to the leaders. One other verse real quickly, and that is Paul's magisterial sermon in Antioch of Pisidia at the beginning of his first missionary journey, on his first missionary journey. But Paul says, this is he gives this marvelous history, but then he talks about Jesus, and he says, those who dwell in Jerusalem and their rulers. So it was the people and the rulers, because they didn't know him, nor the voices of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath, have fulfilled those prophets in condemning him. And though they, the rulers and the people, found no cause for death in him, they asked Pilate that he should be put to death. Now, we're going to come back to some of those things later on, elements in that narrative. But I'm going to go back to my, outline. And so I'm going to pick it up, and forgive the, I don't know, the discursus there, but I don't want to be overly, I don't want to be overly broad in condemnation, and I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. So let me just say, this is the outline that we're using. This is the drama that I'm tracing as I understand it. That Sunday is a day of messianic presentation. They accept him. Why Friday? And the answer, I think, is Monday and Tuesday, where Jesus employs the same strategy that he used again and again. And he drives them to a decision by speaking these hard words. And the hard words are simply, you're going to have to abandon your hope in Pharisaic self-righteousness. All right, now that's Monday and Tuesday. Tuesday night, Jesus is in Bethany with the 12. He's there every night, and that's where he is safe. But Judas sneaks off and goes to the Sanhedrin, to the personal home of Caiaphas, south of the city, and makes a deal to help them arrest Jesus in the absence of the multitude. We made much of this in the last couple of days. So that plot was only laid on Tuesday night. When Judas got there, the Sanhedrinists were in despair. They said, we want to kill him, but we can't. There will be a riot among the people. We'll have to wait till after the feast. And yet Jesus dies on the high day of the feast. How came that to be? The answer is Judas. So Judas is hired not to identify Jesus, but rather to help the Sanhedrinists arrest Jesus in the absence of the multitude. Wednesday, a silent but busy day by my lights, because Sunday, Triumphal Entry, Friday, Crucifixions. That leaves us with a silent day in the record, but it's a busy day because all of the logistics, and we're going to talk about it. The arrangement for a whole cohort of soldiers to arrest a seditionist, a nocturnal trial involving the entire Sanhedrin, a trial before Pilate that it happens about 4:30 in the morning. I'm going to talk about it in just a few minutes, and involves his bringing his whole judicial apparatus out of the palace where he is staying. He's staying in a palace built by Herod, but we'll talk about all of those logistical preparations. Would have taken a great deal of time, even if they were hurrying like mad, which I'm sure they were. And so I think we're advantaged in terms of the coherence, the reasonableness of the story, to have that day, which is unrecorded in the Gospels, because, but it is in fact a busy, necessary day. And one other thing that I think happened on that Wednesday was very possibly Jesus made ready a place where he could keep the Passover with his disciples. And this is what we talked about yesterday, that on Thursday afternoon, Jesus sent Peter and John, and he had arranged a place and had arranged for a signal, because quite simply, Jesus was anxious to keep the place secret from Judas. Because Judas was the Sanhedrinists and the soldiers were ready to arrest Jesus, but they couldn't, and they intended to arrest him. Let me just say this, because there's much confusion here. Luke 22 verse 6 is absolutely explicit that what Judas was hired to do was to help the Sanhedrinists arrest Jesus in the absence of the multitude. That's what Luke says. Now, again, they weren't just going to wait until Jesus was kind of, off somewhere by himself. They knew Jesus wasn't going to let that happen, by the way. They knew that the next time Jesus was going to be in the absence of the multitude would be when he gathered with the disciples for the Passover. So the whole plot laid on Tuesday night that's going to begin to unfold before us here is that Jesus was to be arrested and tried and sentenced and on his way to execution while the city slept. It's impossible to overstate how important this is. So he dispatches, and so my point is that had Judas known the place, he would have had the soldiers there. And it was only because Jesus worked so hard to keep the secret, to keep secret from Judas where the dinner was going to be, the Passover feast, that in point of fact, Jesus had that time in the upper room and had those moments as he made his way down to Gethsemane and had that time with the Father in Gethsemane. So Thursday is a day of a time of messianic preparation. The record really picks up sometime in the afternoon of Thursday, but it's a time of messianic preparation on two counts. In the upper room, which Jesus worked so hard to arrange. Remember, he told his disciples, you don't know with what desire I have desired to keep this feast. And I think he is saying, I have worked hard to make sure we had this time. And so now his teaching and instruction, both in the upper room, and then when he leaves strategically to go down to Gethsemane, we talked about this yesterday, Jesus teaching all the way and praying and so on. So in the upper room, Jesus is preparing his disciples. In Gethsemane, he is preparing his own soul spirit. So twice a time of messianic preparation, but it brings us to what I'm calling a day of messianic perfection. And what I have in mind here, perfection in the sense of the work is going to be accomplished, and I'm thinking specifically of what Jesus is going to cry that we'll talk about in our second session when Jesus cries out, it is finished. So the grand work of redemption, the sacrificial price sufficient to cover the holiness, the infinite holiness of God, is going to be accomplished in those remarkable, dark, blessed hours where Jesus hangs on the cross. That's where we're headed today. But first of all, there is the arrest, and that's where I want to take you. So let me just say, on Thursday night, this is where we left it, after that season of prayer. And I think quite clearly from Luke 22 that with angelic help, Jesus being so exhausted, brought to such an emotional and physical extremity there in the garden by the contemplation of what he was about to endure, the Father sent angels, and perhaps with angelic help, Jesus staggered from the garden, awoke the disciples, and as they emerge, Jesus says, look, my betrayer is at hand. Now, again, I'm going to take you to a map, a different map, and this map, it's from Herschel Shank's book on Jerusalem, and there are places, there are points at which I disagree with it, but it's a helpful map to kind of trace. So let me just say that well, what's going to happen? Let me summarize it first of all. What's going to happen is that Jesus is going to be arrested here in Gethsemane. And after he is arrested, the disciples, of course, we're going to talk about this, scatter, and I don't want to get too deep into it, but then Jesus is going to be hauled up here to the house of Caiaphas. Now, I've said to you before, on Tuesday night, Judas stole off to the personal home of Caiaphas on the hill south of Jerusalem. But in the walled city, high on the western hill, the most powerful and the most wealthy person in all of Israel there was a high priestly villa. That's the point. And that villa would be up there on the western hill where you catch the breezes and so on. And so I'll talk more about it, but he's going to be hauled. And again, I think some people have him, Shanks has him going through a gate there that may have been available to soldiers. I think more likely he comes the same path down here and through the gateway in the south end of the city of David up here. But at either rate, he's going to be hauled. Jesus is going to be hauled back up. Notice, by the way, that the place of the Last Supper is very, very close to where Jesus was tried in the priestly villa. And again, because it's up on the western hill. And that house where Jesus took his disciples that had the large upper room furnished for a villa, furnished for a feast, was clearly a villa. It was one of these massive, beautiful homes with a courtyard and many structures and so on, high on the western hill, and close by was another beautiful, beautiful mansion-like villa that belonged to whoever was the high priest. That's where Jesus is going to be taken to be tried. I say tried, I'm going to talk about it before the Jewish authorities, and they finally will come up with a charge that they can take to Pilate, and therefore Jesus is going to be taken just around the corner to Herod's palace, and we'll talk about it at length, for the trial before Pilate. All right, now I'm going to leave that there because we'll come back to it. But here's what's before us. There is going to be a series of, carefully recorded in the scriptures, after the arrest, Jesus is there's going to be a series of 3 hearings before the Jewish authorities, and then he's going to be turned over, and he's going to be tried before Pilate, and in the midst of the trial before Pilate, Jesus is going to be sent to Herod Antipas, but nothing is going to come of that. So you really have the Roman trial before Pilate. All right, now, let me begin with the record of the arrest, because there's a lot going on here. And to do that, I want to take you to John 18. Now, the arrest of Jesus is recorded in all the Gospels, but in John chapter 18, see if this gets me there. I thought I had it set up. I'm just going to, oh, here we are, John 18. All right, now, beginning of the chapter, here it is. This is the end of the Gethsemane experience. Well, it's not. John doesn't give us the Gethsemane experience, but he mentions that he went to a garden. Doesn't tell us anything about what happened in the garden. But watch John right here in John 18:1. So I'm kind of scatterbrained today, so let me just zero in here. It's very late on Thursday night. Jesus has just endured that gut-wrenching time of prayer and temptation, which he resisted in the Garden of Gethsemane. And now he emerges. And when Jesus, this is, all right, I'm backing up one more step. John says, when Jesus had spoken these words, that is the words of the high priestly prayer that he prayed on his way down across the Valley Kidron. So he's at the foot of the Valley of Kidron. And as I mentioned to you before, there is a brook in antiquity. The valley which you walk into today is very deep, but it was about 60 feet deeper in Jesus' day. It was a very, very deep valley, and there was a brook that ran pretty regularly, and much of it was just what came daily from the temple as everything was washed into it. But he steps over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. Now, John doesn't give us the record, the synoptics do. But then it says Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place. So the point is Judas, who had gone back to the upper room with the soldiers, when he discovered it empty, he knew that this was where Jesus often met or stayed with his disciples. So here's the story of the arrest. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees. Now, let me explain carefully. As I said to you before, the Romans allowed their constituent peoples, in this case Israel, the Jews, a great deal of self-rule, especially with regard to religious matters. They really didn't want anything to do with that. And the Sanhedrin was that body of 70 Jewish leaders who oversaw all matters Jewish that the Romans allowed them. But the Romans did not allow them a force of arms. So if they are going to arrest someone, they're going to have to use Roman soldiers, and that's what's going on. So the Sanhedrin had appealed to Pilate undoubtedly, and Pilate had given the order for a cohort, a detachment of troops. And notice it says they came with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Now, let me just say, before I get to the narrative here, I said this yesterday, but it's so important to understand that these soldiers, number one, they're mercenaries. I say mercenaries. They're part of Rome. They're probably just brought in here. A certain squadrons, certain battalions, what I want to say, certain legions were brought in and for a while, and then they were rotated out. So they don't speak the local language. They don't, in many cases, they're not really familiar with things. But as part of their training, without a doubt, when they were assigned to Israel, they were trained and prepared for seditions that happen in this land. So they know something about Jewish seditions. They know that they're fierce. They know that they're very expert at guerrilla warfare, that they rather than trying to meet you with a huge force, they sneak up on the soldiers and so on. So the point is that the order has come down. You've got to understand this, folks, that the strategy employed by Jesus' Jewish enemies, who by reason of Jesus' popularity could not simply take him and do Stephen to him, you know, just take him off and stone him somewhere. They could do it to Stephen because Stephen was nobody. And the Romans had looked the other way, but that couldn't happen. So the Sanhedrinists could not just be done with Jesus on their own. So in order to be done with Jesus, they had to get the Romans involved. And in order to do that, the Sanhedrinists had a strategy. And that strategy was, and I'll show it to you in just a bit, that strategy was to make the case that Jesus is a seditionist. Now that's the whole background here. So when the order had gone to the Antonia to fetch the soldiers, I'm sure the order read, you're to go and put down a sedition. There is a simmering sedition. There is a pretender king. He's dangerous. And so they were fully panoplied and they were on high alert. That's important. So they come undoubtedly in formation and so on. And now they're in the open valley. So you probably have the whole detachment. If they had to split up a little bit when they're in the walled cities and the narrow lanes, not now. They're in the open valley and so on. So here you have this whole detachment of troops. And by the way, let me show you something. This says that he came with a detachment of troops, which again is a formal word that means a force of about 600 men, not all infantry, and so there'd be different ones, but a huge force. Well, let's just compare this real quickly. I'm just going to drop it down. No, I can go there. Look at Matthew 26. This is the same story. So this is Jesus talking to his disciples, and it says, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs. You go to Luke 22, a multitude and same thing in Mark 14 with a great multitude. Where am I? Yeah, Mark 14. Now my point is simply this. I'll take it back to John, but the fact is that there was a significant force, and it's late at night now. It's got to be very, very close to midnight. And imagine you're one of these disciples, and this has been a strange day, and you've kept the Passover, and Jesus' heart was so heavy, and now he spent that season in prayer. You slept through it, to be sure, most of it, but nonetheless, this is, now you walk out in the middle of the night, you wonder what you're doing out here. You probably intended just to go back to that, I'm sure they did, to go back to that cave and spend the night. But Jesus says, no, come with me. And he goes out, and here is a multitude, a cohort of troops, and on high alert. Now, there's really a lot going on here. You know the story. I got to be quick. Jesus, therefore, I love this, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said, now, understand what's going on here. This could get ugly real fast. And Jesus, frankly, had prayed in his high priestly prayer in the last chapter, just moments earlier, that God would protect those whom he had, who his followers, because he knew that this was going to be a dramatic moment. And so Jesus wants to, it's amazing because he steps forward. He went forward. Now, normally, if there's somebody who's you're to arrest, he'll hide or flee, but he stepped forward and he asked, whom are you seeking? And I picture maybe the leader of the detachment opening the orders and saying, it's Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus says, I am he. I'm the one. And Judas, who is, well, it says, interestingly, it says, all right, let me just interrupt myself. The three synoptics mention that Judas did come and kiss Jesus. Now, that was the signal to the soldiers. But I think the way it happened is this, that Jesus didn't wait for that. Because you see, he didn't want this to break into some sort of fist fight, and then swords are drawn, and some of his disciples, and of course, I'm saying again, those Roman soldiers are on high alert, and the bloodletting is not going to bother them a little bit, and they're not going to have to answer for it. They've been set out to, and so here is the supposed seditionists, there is disciples. This could get ugly really quickly. So I think what happened is Jesus steps forward and says, I'm the one. I am the one. Ego I me. I'm not convinced at all it's a reference to the divine name. I don't think Roman soldiers would have recognized it at all. It's just the way you say in the Greek, I'm the one, it's me, I am he. And then I think probably Judas came up and dutifully administered the identifying kiss just to kind of put a seal on it. John doesn't say that. The synoptics all have that story. But it's interesting that John does go on to say this. He says, when he asked, when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Now, folks, this is a strange. Listen, everybody has a different idea. I tend toward the mundane. I tend to think of it as a drama that is really happening. And at any rate, I think what happened was probably that here they are on high alert. They're ready to charge. Jesus steps forward, and the Roman, borrowed from the Greek phalanx system, had just ranks, one upon the other, very, very tight. And Jesus steps forward and says, "I'm the one, arrest me." And they're so startled, they stumble back over each other. And I think that's the point, that they drew back and fell to the ground. That's not what they expected. It's kind of the Keystone Cops make an arrest, if you don't mind, if you know the Keystone Cops. But the point is, and then Jesus said again, "Whom are you seeking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he said, "I have told you, I am here. If you seek me, let these other go their way." And John says that it might be fulfilled of which he spoke in the last chapter, "Of those whom you gave me, I've lost none." And so this is really a remarkable scene as Jesus, well, again, is careful to identify himself as the one they're after. Well, leaving it alone. Oh, and then I got to say, of course, that Simon Peter, and imagine now, Jesus has made the case and he's being so careful. And everybody, by now, all eyes are upon him. And Simon Peter, once again, open mouth and short foot, has that little dagger, probably the dagger from when that he had brought along to slay the lamb. A family had a personal little knife that you would use to slay the Passover lamb. And he probably had it in his bag, and he dug it out and wildly lopped off the ear of a serpent, not serpent, servant. All right. Scratch that. He lopped off the ear of one of the servants, and we're told by Luke, and Luke alone, that Jesus repaired that ear. And he said, "Put your sword into your sheath." And he says elsewhere, if you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. And that is Jesus, that's recorded in the synoptics. And I think Jesus' point is, I'm trying to keep a handle on things here, Peter. Do you realize? And then he says, "Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" We talked about this yesterday. All right, well, Jesus is arrested. And now, again, he is going to be taken up to the way back up there on the Western Hill. And I'm going to say, again, by now it is very, very late. And there is going to be a series of hearings before the Jewish authorities. Now, let me give you some background. And I've got several things to say about this, so bear with me if you will. Number one, I call them hearings because they really aren't trials in the sense that they are trying to determine the guilt or innocence. They've assumed the guilt, clearly. But on the other hand, they don't have a charge. And I'll talk about this in just a moment, but they are frustrated, the Sanhedrinists are, the Jewish authorities, because, well, here's the point. They have made plans. They have a date with Pilate to bring Jesus to Pilate to be tried as a seditionist. But here's a reality. You have to understand this. Jesus, all through his ministry, had claimed to be Messiah. And it was part of the two claims. He is the Christ, the Son of the Lord, living God. Now you understand that the Greek word Christos is the same as the Christ is the same as the Old Testament word Mashiach, which is Messiah, which means anointed. So the point is this, that, in the Old Testament, the word Messiah is one of the titles given the promised deliverer of Genesis 3:15, but it's not real important. It's used about 9 times, and it's meaningful, but it's not real important. But evidently, quite clearly, during the intertestamental period, those 400 years, during that period before the New Testament, that one word came to be the title that summed up everything the Old Testament said about this coming deliverer. And so the Messiah was the deliverer, and to the Jewish mind, and legitimately so, it meant, above all other things, I would say, king. He was a king. Now, in the Jewish mind, and appropriately, Messiah is king. Well, here's the point. Rome had no room for pretender kings. Jesus went about the country for the better part of 3 years making the case that he was the Messiah deliverer. But he knew that if he actually used the word Messiah, it would be incendiary, it would be offensive to the Roman authorities, and it would arm his enemies to make the case that he was dangerous to Rome. And so what Jesus did, because he was wise as a serpent, this is a lot of background, but it's so important to what's going to happen here. What Jesus did, because he was wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove, is he took to himself scores of Old Testament passages and word pictures and titles and so on, and so he doesn't call himself Messiah, but he identifies himself as Messiah by taking these Old Testament concepts and word pictures. His favorite title for himself, as you know, is Son of Man. 81 times in the Gospels, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. That's right out of Daniel chapter 7, where the Ancient of Days takes his throne after the 4 kingdoms and dispatches one like unto a Son of Man appears before him and is dispatched to establish a 5th world kingdom, the Messianic kingdom. So there's not a more Messianic passage and not a more Messianic title than those Son of Man in Daniel 7. So, but on the other hand, now think about this, and this is actually going to happen, but think about this. If Jesus says, I am the Son of Man to the Jewish ear, and specifically to the ears of the Sanhedrinists, this is offensive. You're claiming to be Messiah. But can they go to Pilate and say, this guy claims to be the Son of Man? What's Pilate going to say? He's going to, well, me too. See, that means nothing to him. And all these passages and terms and so on that Jesus takes to himself, which identifies him to the Jewish people as Messiah, it would mean nothing. So what Jesus is doing is carefully, the only time he accepts the title Messiah before he actually begins to tell his disciples about his death, the only time in the record he accepts the title Messiah is that woman at the well in Psyche in John chapter 4, where she says, I know that the Jews are waiting for Messiah, and Jesus said, the one speaking to you is he. But that's at a well in Psyche in the middle of Samaria and so on. So I'm saying this, what's that got to do with what's in front of us? This is the frustration that the Jewish authorities have. They have concocted this grand plot. It is unfolding. They are going to get Jesus killed by accusing him as a seditionist, in which case the Romans will have to crucify him. But they can't find any witnesses who can remember him saying out loud, I am Messiah, because he hadn't. He was clever. Now, having said that, my point is this, that the Jewish hearings are not about determining guilt or innocence in the sense of a trial. They've assumed he is guilty, but they need, it's more of a grand jury. They need to come up with an indictment. That's what's going on. Now, with that background, I want to walk you through the 3 stages of the Jewish trial. They're very distinct. I'm going to keep calling it a trial, but they're really hearings. But they're very distinct stages. Now, come back to me. I want to make a couple of comments, and they're very important. Number one, they're important to me, and I get to decide. What can I tell you? Number one, you know what? There are so many who insist that the narrative of the trials in the 4 Gospels are hopelessly confused at best and contradictory at worst, but there's no way to reconcile it. That's an absolute lie. They fit together perfectly. But you have to understand this. Let's just take the Jewish trials. You have to harmonize, because there are 3 stages to the Jewish trial. And I'm going to walk you through in just a moment. But the first stage is recorded only by John. Only by John. The second stage is recorded is recorded in Matthew and Mark, but in neither Luke or John. And the third stage is recorded only in Luke, although it's referenced briefly in Matthew and Mark. So you have to harmonize the Gospels, and they fit together perfectly. I'm going to try and trace them through. The other thing, the other point to be made, and for this I'm going to haul the map up, and this is just, forgive me, I guess I'm doing the teaching, I guess, and this might not be important to very many people, but it kind of is to me. So let me just take you back to a map here, and let me just say that this is real history, and real history has to be coherent. It has to really, it's in other words, it fits as history. Everything will fit together and you can make sense of it. And one of the elements is chronology. Chronology is not a lot of fun, but it's very important. Times, I read somewhere, time is God's way to make sure everything doesn't happen at once. And everything didn't happen at once. And so you've got to be able to trade. Well, the point is simply this, and I'm going to make the point in half a minute, but there are various propositions as to where Jesus was taken. Was he taken up here? Was he taken to some Herod Antipas house and so on? The fact is that you don't have much time to get this all done. And I think it's important to understand that he was taken, first of all, the Jewish hearings were here, and then the Roman hearings were here, and they were very, very close. And Herod Antipas, I think, was probably here. Now, I'll make this point as I go, but I'm just going to argue that you at least have to take into account the fact that if you've only got a very, very short time, and I'll spell it out, I think about an hour and a half once the Jewish trials are over, and you got Jesus being hauled back again and again across the whole city, there's simply not time. But if you understand it, well, I think you can make sense of it. Now, there's one other point to be made before I embark on our study of the Jewish hearings, so stay with me. I know that when you think of Friday, you think of the actual crucifixion. We're going to come to that, but I just think this background is so important. So let me just say one other thing, and this is really important and delicate. And that is this, that during the court, and everybody acknowledges this, that during the course of these Jewish hearings, the leadership, the Sanhedrin, are going to violate a staggering number of jurisprudential protocols and canons and requirements. So they're going to violate their own jurisprudential rules. And they are rules which they embrace very, very strongly and are justly proud of. And listen, it's a reality in the record. There's no getting around it. The fact that the trial is held at night, absolutely illegal. The fact that it's in a place where, other than it's not public. It's got to be public. It's not in a private home. You can't have a trial in a private home. The fact that witnesses are suborned. It says explicitly they sought false witness. The fact that when the witnesses disagreed, as happens in Matthew explicitly, Jesus was not set free by Jewish protocols. If in a capital case where a man is going to be executed if found guilty, if two supposed eyewitnesses contradict one another, immediately the man is released. The fact that he was crucified the same day that he was found guilty, all of those are violation of protocols that are precious to Israel, and which they took directly from the Mosaic Law. They reflect I'd love to talk about it. The Mosaic Law was blinding in its efficacy and its justice. And there were so many protocols in place to make sure that, you know what, a culture cannot rise above its jurisprudential system to the degree that laws are applied fairly and justly and equally. To that degree, you've got a healthy culture. And the healthiest there ever was the culture that Yahweh ruled over in the Old Testament, because they did so under his law, and his law had the most stunning, not only civilizing, but just they were really stunningly equitable and careful canons of jurisprudence. Now, let's come back. The fact is that many of those protocols are going to be violated. It is a sore spot in the story, and I understand. And I don't think there's any whitewashing it other than this. Folks, 2 points. Number one, I would invite you to take the attitude of Saul of Tarsus. And that attitude in Acts 26, verse 9, I'll not take you there, but in Acts 26, 9, Paul, the apostle, remembers his days as Saul of Tarsus and his persecuting campaign. And he says this. He says, I verily thought within myself, I ought to do these things against Jesus of Nazareth. And he says in 1 Timothy that the reason he was available for the grace of God, because he didn't sin with a high hand. but he mounted a gut-wrenchingly terrible season of persecution against the believers. And why? Because he thought within himself. Now, why would he think that? I think the answer is Jesus claimed to be God come in the flesh. And as precious as that is to you, it is the single most difficult truth claim God has ever set before mankind, that this human being is in fact God come in the flesh. And I think that you take that microcosmic spirit of one Jewish leader, Saul of Tarsus, and I think you can extrapolate it over the entire, they're thinking this man, and I'm going to say again, you and I believe in the deity of Jesus. The single most important argument we would bring in favor of Jesus' claim to be God come in the flesh is his resurrection. These people don't have the resurrection. This is before Jesus dies and is resurrected. What they have is a man, a Nazarene, a human being who, yes, he's a wonder worker. Yes, he's done good things, but he claims to be God. So, and I think this is what's behind Jesus' remarkably gracious statement on the cross, and we'll talk about it a little later. Forgive them, they don't know what they do, in the sense that it's so hard for us to appreciate how bottomlessly difficult that was. So I'm not making excuses exactly, but I'm saying, all right, let's put ourselves in the moment and realize that what is at stake in the mind of these Jewish leaders is the single most precious, I say single most, one of the most, I got to quit dealing in superlatives quite so much, but one of the most important and central truths that they have embraced as Jews, the Shema, the behold, O God, you're the Lord, behold, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord. Now, there's a lot more to this, and it gets more complicated, and I do believe that the Jews of that day understood the possibility of plurality in the Godhead, but nonetheless, from the mind of the mind and heart of the Jewish leaders. Now, there is, mixed with that, there's some real selfishness, and there is the Caiaphas mentality. If we don't kill him, they'll come and take away our place in our nation. There is that mentality that Jesus represented by the vine dressers who said, this is the son, let's kill him and take him the inherit. There is that, but I don't think that's prevails. And I think the prevailing attitude is, he may be a good man, but it's awful blasphemy. And that's exactly what they appeal to in John 19, verse 7, when they finally get Pilate to crucify Jesus. They say, well, if you won't crucify him as a seditionist, then he ought to die by our law because he makes himself the Son of God. And that reality, which is so precious to us, and we have learned to take so much in stride, and it's not hard on us, but I keep saying, ask yourself what it would have been like to live in that first century and be confronted by a man who had a whole human history going back to the time when he was emerged from his mother's womb, and he's claiming to be God. So I'm gonna put a ribbon on all of it, and let's go to the Jewish trials. But my point is that yes, there were illegalities, and it is an embarrassment. But I think you have to factor in these two very, very important issues. Number one is the difficulty of Jesus' claim to be God come in the flesh, and number two is the anger that Jesus has quite frankly precipitated in the course of this week. So if they were willing to put up with him when he was going around the synagogues doing miracles, he's on their turf, and he has alienated everybody. Now, I think he's done so justly. I think he's done so righteously. But I'm saying factor in that absolute, that boiling pot of anger and resentment and embarrassment. I mean, there's a lot of embarrassment that's gone on as Jesus put them to silence and then spoke those woes upon the scribes and the Pharisees. So the point is that there are illegalities. I don't think it bespeaks. As a matter of fact, it is absolutely contrary to to Jewish law and to the Jewish psyche. So it doesn't speak. Let's not extrapolate that to Jews at large or anything like that. It was a moment in time. They were faced with an unspeakably difficult claim, and it was a week where they were driven almost beyond themselves. They were unhinged with anger, and so they do. It's expediency. We got to get this done. We've worked at it. We got to get it done. In order to get it done, we had to arrest him and then try him and get him on the way to the cross in the middle of the night before the city wakes up, because there'll be a riot. All right. So to that end, now I'm really going to go quickly. I had a lot more to say, but I'm using up all my time. So let me go quickly through the Jewish hearings. And as I say, there are 3 stages. First of all, and only John tells this story. It's so interesting. John writing late and I think deliberately supplementing the synoptics. And so in John 18, you have the story here where I'm going to go quick now. That all right, so Jesus is arrested and he is taken first of all to Anise. Now notice in the yellow, they led him away to Anise first, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas. Now, the thing is that the synoptics, and John knows his readers already have the synoptics have already said that he was taken to Caiaphas. So they arrested him and they took him to Caiaphas. All right, they are taking him to Caiaphas, but Caiaphas has this huge priestly villa, and that's where Jesus is being taken. Now, Anise is Caiaphas's father-in-law. He is the high priest emeritus, as it were, the patriarch. He had been high priest, he'd been deposed, he had muscled his sons-in-law onto the into the office and so on. So he was a very, very crooked, wicked man, but he undoubtedly had quarters there in the priestly villa. So this aged priest has quarters in the villa, and what's going to happen undoubtedly is they're going to bring Jesus in. They finally got him, and now the soldiers are bringing him, and the word goes out, because I'm sure it's late at night. It's probably midnight or after. And so all these Sanhedrinists who had gathered in the high priestly villa because they thought they might get him, they're sleeping and slumbering in this part of the, so they got to run around saying, and there's a big middle hall, and so they're going to gather there. But while they're making ready, Anise wants to interview him. Now, very quickly, this is what happens. He's brought to Anise. I'm just going to tell you the story. And Anise says, you can follow it in the text there, starting down here, verse 18. I'm sorry, verse 19. Anise said to him, the verse 19, the high priest asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Now, one of the unshakable jurisprudential protocols, or it was more than that, it was a canon, it was a rule, was that you cannot interrogate the accused. Now, this comes right out of, I won't develop it, right out of the Old Testament in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. That's a jurisprudential canon. When God says several times in the Old Testament, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every matter be established. It's talking about a person on trial, and you only convict him through the eyewitness testimony of at least 2, preferably 3. And they took from that properly, and this is the reason we have a 5th Amendment, that it was wrong to interrogate the accused. And so Anise, who is just, again, they're all frustrated because they don't even have a charge. And so Anise says, he just asked him, tell me about your disciples and your doctrine. And Jesus says there in verse 20, I've always spoken openly in synagogues and the temple. I haven't said anything in secret. Ask them. Why? And they have heard me. It said to them, indeed, they know what I said. Now, all Jesus is doing, and I don't think there's any snarkiness. I think Jesus always handles himself with, he knows what's really behind this, but I don't think I don't think Jesus handles himself with, I don't think he's treating them with contempt but I think he simply says to Anise, wait a minute, I've always spoken in open. Why wouldn't you ask the witnesses? That's what the law demands. Check with the witnesses. Well, when he said that, one of these soldiers, and Anise probably had a soldier who was assigned to him more or less as a bodyguard, but he was standing nearby and he struck Jesus. Now, another protocol of Jewish law, of Jewish jurisprudence, criminal trials, is that you can never punish anybody until he's convicted in any way. He can't be punished until he's convicted. And so here he is cuffed, and Jesus turns to the man and he says, if I've spoken evil, bear witness. But if well, in other words, if I haven't done a crime, why would you strike me? Now again, all Jesus is doing is saying to Anise, this is all we're told. And then it says in the next verse, Anise sent him bound to Caiaphas across the hall. That is, Caiaphas has been setting up the central, the great room where they're going to have the trial. But all Jesus, it's stunning to me how thoroughly in charge of himself, and even not in some divine sense where he's manipulating and everybody gets puppetized when he walks in the room. I'm not saying that at all. But Jesus is entirely and put this against the backdrop of the prayers in Gethsemane, the angst and the suffering. And Jesus depends. I think his prayers are being answered. And with calmness, he simply says to the aged high priest, "Why don't you live up to the law that you are here to enforce?" Nothing comes of it, and it's time for him to meet now before the greater. So what you have, and I got to be quick here. Let me just say this though, it is really stunning. I'm not going to stop on this over much. We'll refer to it. I'm not going to go to the passages, but it is stunning the degree to which Peter's denials are interwoven in this whole story of the Jewish trials. Peter gets a lot of ink. I mean, it's clear that the Gospelists have a point to be, the Spirit of God has a point to be made, and we'll come back to that after the fact. But I can show you here just real quickly that even in the story of Jesus before Anise, you have up here in verse 12, they led him away to Anise, but then here in verses 15 all the way down to verse 18, you have the story of Peter's first denial as he gathers himself he is able to make his way into the courtyard, that very courtyard where of the high priestly villa. And so Jesus is being dragged through that courtyard, being taken from one place to the next. But let me take you to Matthew then. And let me say, that's the first stage before Anise. And it's really just ad hoc preliminary, the aged high priest trying to maybe help out his son-in-law by getting Jesus to say something incriminating. But Jesus just says, no, live up to your own law. But now he is hauled before the great Sanhedrin. And I'm not going to iterate them once again, but there are a lot of illegalities about this. But suffice it to say, what happens is that they try and bring witnesses. They're desperately looking for they need to be able to go to Pilate and say, there are witnesses who heard this man claim to be a king, claim to be Messiah. And by reason of Jesus' cleverness, they can't find him. And they bring false witnesses and they contradict. And what happens is, and Matthew tells this more fully, so I'm going to take you here. I want you to see this, that I think, now again, the plot, let me just remind you, the plot is to get Jesus on his way to the cross while the city sleeps, under cover of night. And to that end, they already have a date with Pilate. And that date is for about 4:30. I'll come to that in just a moment. And yet here they are in the middle of the night. They can't come up with a charge. And Caiaphas is frustrated. And so finally, Caiaphas puts Jesus under oath. Right here in verse 62. The high priest, this is Caiaphas, arose and he said, "Do you answer nothing? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus kept silent. You know why? Because he's under no moral or legal obligation to incriminate himself in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. It's wrong to interrogate the accuser under Jewish law. But finally, the high priest, and I think probably he's watching his wrist stopwatch or his wrist hourglass, and he realizes 4:30 is on is going to be here soon, and so he comes up with a ploy. And it's right here. The high priest answered and said to him, "I put you under oath by the living God." Now, this is high-handedly, once again, a violation of their own law because you can't interrogate the witness. But, the witness you can. You can't interrogate the accused. But Caiaphas is really frustrated. And so he puts him under oath. And he says, "Tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of God?" Now, why did he articulate it that way? Because he knew that this is exactly what Jesus had claimed. Now, I want you to think for a minute. And I know I'm past my hour already, but this is important, I think. I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to honestly think about it as you sit there. Of those two, Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. He claimed to be God come in the flesh. All right, now, of those two, which is the most innately offensive to the Jewish mind? I've already talked about it. Clearly, the claim to deity is what angers them. But now let me ask you another question. Of those two, which is most politically incendiary? which might be used to accuse Jesus before Pilate? Obviously, the answer is Christ, Messiah, King. That's what they want to hear. So he says, but because I think it's so indicative of the fact that everywhere Jesus went, he claimed to be, I am the Christ. Remember John 20 and verse 31. These are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and believing you might have life through his name. That's what Jesus said. Remember Matthew 16. Whom do you say that I am? Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Praise the Lord. You got it. So this is what Jesus claimed. And so in Caiaphas's mind, how can he say no to this? I know this is what he claimed. He doesn't care in this particular instance about his claim to be deity. It's deeply offensive to him, Caiaphas, but he doesn't care right now because he's trying to come up with an indictment that he can take to Pilate. So he says, tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of God? And let me say, I think this was a shot. I think this was I think Caiaphas, he was desperate, but he must have been absolutely surprised and delighted when Jesus said, right there in the orange, it is as you said. Now, let me point something out here just in passing. I don't want to lose the momentum of the story here, but if you go to Mark, we can do it right here. I'll just go there quickly. Here you have the same story, and notice what it is. In this case, he asked the question there in the yellow, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed, the Son of God? And Jesus said, I am. Well, now, wait a minute. In Matthew, he said, you have said it. Well, or it is as you said. Again, please understand this. I think we've talked about it before, that this conversation is almost certainly happening in Aramaic, the tongue of the Jewish people, the standard language they spoke. Aramaic, interestingly, does not have an explicit word for yes, but there are any number of expressions. And the strongest expression by which you can affirm a question, give a positive response, is you said it. It is as you said. Now, it's a strong affirmation. And Matthew, writing to Jews, he gives a very formal, literal record of that. This is what Jesus said. It is as you said. But his audience, the Jewish audience, is going to know exactly what literally it's you said it. That's really you said it. And the Jewish audience reading Matthew is going to know immediately he said, yes, I am. But on the other hand, Mark, Peter, writing primarily perhaps for a Roman audience, gives it to us in the Greek. And once again, it's ego eimi, a very strong I am. So in either case, what I want you to see, and again, I think this must have amazed and stunned Caiaphas, but more than that, it delighted him, because Jesus said, it is as you said. Are you the Christ, the Son of God? Exactly, I am. Now, Jesus is going to go on to say that as such, he is going to come in the clouds of heaven. He is making the claim. He is reinforcing it. You bet I am. As a matter of fact, I am the fulfillment. See, it's interesting that Pilate is asked, I am sorry, I'll get these confused. Caiaphas, just put yourself in a moment again. Caiaphas desperately is just saying, all right, I'll put you under oath. Are you the Christ, the Son of God? Now, Jesus knows exactly what's afoot. And he looks at him and he says, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be the one who comes in the clouds of heaven. Now that's Daniel 7 once again. So Jesus has affirmed as positively and dramatically and forcefully as words can make the point, you bet I'm Messiah. Well, the high priest tore his clothes, said he's spoken blasphemy and so on, and everybody rejoiced. We got him. We got him. He heard it. 70 guys, as many as 70 in the room, just heard him not only confess to the answer, but he positively said he's Messiah. So they think, we got him. Now, this is all, of course, exactly as Jesus intends, if you don't mind. He knows that he's got to go to Pilate, and he knows how frustrated the Sanhedrinists are, and he's been silent the whole time, but now he breaks his silence and he affirms, no, you bet I am. Now, and everybody in the room said he is deserving of death. Now, I want to go back to the record, and I'm going to break out for just a minute because again, this is a very important harmonizing issue. That's not the way to say it. It's important to harmonize at this point to really understand what happens, because the problem is this, that one of the protocols, I mentioned it, was that you could never have a trial at night. Specifically, what the rabbinical literature said was you can't have a trial between sundown and sunup. And the reason was quite simple, that you couldn't have a trial without witnesses and people go to bed at night, so you can't have a trial between sundown and sunup. And quite clearly, I don't know of any explanation other than this, and it fits everything about this, and I think it's in everything about the culture. So I think the point is this, that the Sanhedrinists knew that what they had done had been illegal on several counts, but one of the most obvious and egregious is that they had done it in the middle of the night. And they were genuinely fearful that Pilate might be looking for some. Pilate was not happy about this. He knew that it was only out of resentment, and he didn't like being jerked around this way. But Pilate, but the point is, I think the Sanhedrin are trepidatious about the possibility that Pilate will throw the whole thing out. You had a trial in the middle of the night, you can't do that. So they determined that they would wait until the first blush of the rising sun. Now, I don't mean dawn when the eastern horizon becomes bright and yellow. I mean just gray. The first time that the grayness of dawn begins to appear on the eastern horizon. We'll wait until then. We'll bring him back in here. We'll ask him the same question, and then when he affirms it once again, he was aggressive about affirming. We don't have to worry about that. Oh man, he came out of his chair. So we don't have to, we'll bring him back in, and that way we can say that we tried him after sunup. Now that's the plan. In order to fulfill that plan, Jesus has to be held for a time. And I picture him, there are 2 points to be made here. I picture him, again, the villa is undoubtedly just that, and there is a great hall, but there are other installations, and maybe there are wine cellars or whatever. And so Jesus is dragged across. Now he's a prisoner. The only physical abuse he's suffered heretofore is when that Caiaphas, Anise's bodyguards cuffed him. But Jesus is manacled, and he's taken and held somewhere, and they are holding him in anticipation of the first blush of dawn. Now, let me say that they do bring him back in, and there is that third stage of the Jewish hearing, and only Luke records that. But I'll come to that in a minute. But there is another thing that happens when he is hauled off, as it were, when he is taken off to be held for a time. It's undoubtedly with Roman soldiers, and I'm going to fine-tune the record here just a little bit. I can't fine-tune the record. Your understanding, I trust, of the record. Because they answered him and said he is deserving of death. And then in the green, you have this. Then they spat in his face and beat him. Others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who is the one who struck you?" Folks, this is not the Sanhedrinists. I don't think they do it. I think it, again, they're not vulgar. They're not barbarians. They are angry, and they are intent, and they are offended by Jesus' claim to be God come in the flesh, but this is, and I can prove to you. Now I'm going to take it because Mark does the same thing, and again, the point to be made here is that this is more or less Hebrew storytelling. Just then this happened, then this happened. Now, in point of fact, Mark says here they all condemn him, and then it says then some, who are the some, began to spit on him and so on. So again, it's very, very Hebrew in the sense that the story just moves forward, but there are details that are important, and Luke helps us. So let me take you to Luke, and we're going to be there anyway, but Luke is more specific. And in Luke, we're told that, all right, there's the arrest. Here it is. Now, Luke, now I got to help you here. Luke does not give us either the trial before Anise or the hearing before the Sanhedrin. It makes no reference to it. He does trace Peter's denials and so on, but he says that as a matter of fact, it's interesting. He tells the story of Peter's denial here, but then it says this. Now, I want you to hear this. Now, the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him. Tells the story, is it blindfolded and prophesy. So he identifies the people doing this, not as the Sanhedrin. I'm going to go back to it. There would have been soldiers. And those soldiers were probably attendant upon the Sanhedrinists, and it was they, Roman soldiers. So I think this is the story. Not that finally Jesus confessed he was the Christ and all those aged men fell upon him and began to beat him in some really wicked, brutal season of vengeance and so on. I don't think that at all. I think they probably were rather sober about it. But there were soldiers who were assigned to take, and they were given the order. I want you to take him out there to that wine cellar and just keep him until we call him back, because we have to wait for the first blush of day. It's those soldiers, the men who held Jesus, who mocked and beat and so on. So now Jesus has been abused. And by the way, when the sun does just begin to sprinkle a little gray on the horizon, they call Jesus back in, and he's going to be brought back again across that courtyard. Interestingly enough, Peter is in that courtyard. And so as Peter is denying Jesus for the third time, he's warming his hands and denying Jesus. And now the Bible says right here that Jesus turned, and right here, while he was speaking, the rooster crowed. Now think about this, folks. Think about the synchronism here. Jesus had said, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. I think that's a spirit-enabled prophecy. And the rooster crows at the very, very blush of dawn. And I don't think it's this or that rooster. I don't think he means that rooster or those two. He just means before the roosters start to crow, first thing in the morning, before the sun comes up, you're going to deny me 3 times. So Peter denies Jesus. The rooster crows. Now, what are the Sanhedrinists waiting for? The first blush of dawn. So now Jesus is being hauled back across the courtyard. And as it says there, he turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the word. And he had spoken that word twice just hours earlier, but Peter had forgotten it. So Peter went out and wept bitterly. And so now you have the third stage of the trial. It's recorded only here in Luke. And notice what he says in Luke 22 and verse 66. As soon as it was day, the elders of the people gathered and so on. And all, there are no witnesses. They simply try and rehearse what they had done before. And so they simply say, if you are the Messiah. Notice they're not very interested in deity. If you're the Messiah, oh, we're so excited about this, tell us. Well, Jesus won't do it. He says, if I tell you, you won't believe. And then in verse 70, they said, okay, then, are you the Son of God? Now, understand the dynamics. The claim to deity was the real offense, but that's not what animates him here. And yet Jesus refused to allow the record to be at all truncated, to be at all confused. And so he had confessed, as he always had, and it was important that it all be accepted, that he was the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's what Caiaphas had asked him, and Jesus said, absolutely I am. Now they drag him back in, and they're in a hurry. They want to get him to Pilate. All of this has to happen before the sun comes up. And so now they say, are you the Christ? I'm not going to say that. Okay. The Son of God. Oh, and he said, I am. So you rightly say that I am. So now we've heard it from his own mouth, and he's taken off to Pilate. All right, so those are the 3 stages of the Jewish hearings. And now we come to Pilate, and I haven't left myself any time, but I'm going to take you back to John. And Pilate is, let me just say this, and I could get so lost in this story, but I will warn you this, that I am going to, John 18:28 is where John picks this story up. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the Praetorium. I'll come back to that. But I'm going to warn you something. I have a perspective on Pilate that is a bit different than many. Not than everybody. And I can point you to good, solid scholars from whom at whose feet I have sat and who have the same approach. But I do not believe Caiaphas certainly he's not the primary villain in this story. And I really think I have learned to have high regard for the man Pilate in this scene. I'll even say to you, maybe just to whet your appetite, I think very possibly we may see Pilate in heaven. Now, I know that the prevailing attitude is that he was a cynic. And I would just ask you, as we simply trace the narrative, what do you see of cynicism? I know you can always go to the what is truth. We'll come to that. But man, Pilate is remarkable. And we have the testimony of Peter that I read to you before, where Peter says that you killed Jesus when Pilate was determined, he uses a strong word, to let him go. So let me just take you to this. And let me say again, two things. It's about 4:30 in the morning. And Jesus is going to be taken just a little ways because, again, I think the house of Caiaphas, it's quite identifiable. All right, that's not right. The house of Caiaphas, there are a couple of places, and yea, verily, perhaps three, that contend to be Caiaphas's house. It's not as well remembered as, for instance, the upper room. If you come out the Zion Gate, you go south through this walled city of Jerusalem, through the Armenian quarter, and you come out the Zion Gate, and right in front of you is a wall, and behind it is a church, an Armenian church, with rebar sticking out the top of the walls. Been there ever since I've been going to Jerusalem, Israel. And I'm convinced, and I think there is really little reason to doubt, quite frankly, that that is the place where Jesus was tried, the drama that we just traced, where that was the house of Caiaphas, the site of those hearings. And it really is even a little further north, about here. Now, because we have such a brief time to work with, it's helpful to me to realize he didn't have to because, all right, here's the other thing. Very quickly, don't go here, Bookman. There's a debate, it's not much of a debate anymore, as to where Pilate was when Jesus was tried before Pilate. And from the 12th century on, and only from the 12th century on, the Crusaders, the tradition has been that it was at the Fortress Antonia. But that's not the early tradition, and it really makes no sense. So I think better that it was at Herod's palace. Now, the point is, Pilate is the governor, the prefect. He lives in Caesarea Maritima, down by the Mediterranean, in a palace that Herod had built there. When he comes to Jerusalem, as he is for the feast, where is he going to stay? A soldier's barracks, or one of the most luxurious, well-equipped, beautiful, well-defended palaces on the face of the earth, Herod's palace? There's every reason, and everybody pretty much today, well, I only know of one scholar who has rejected it. I'm not a scholar, but I read scholars. But the point is that I think he is here in Herod's palace. Now, in John 18, we read, let me take you back to it. I think I got the map up there now. I'm going new share, and I go to the scriptures, that they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the Praetorium. The word Praetorium just means the domicile of the senior Roman officer. So whoever is in town, and the most important guy, where's he staying? And it actually comes from the battlefield. You'd have a lot of fences, but the one was the Praetorium. Well, the Praetorium, in this case, is where Pilate is staying. Says it was early morning. I'm saying about 4:30 in the morning. And this is what happens. I got to be quick, because let me just say this, that in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 13, Pilate says to Timothy, he said, I adjure thee by the living God, that you and by the good confession which Jesus made before Pontius Pilate. And it's just stunning to me that Paul could make that sort of offhanded reference to the set of events that are before us, and expect Timothy to be so familiar with it that he would understand what he was saying. Timothy, press yourself into the mold of Jesus before Pilate. That's what he's saying. Well, we need to know this. And so let me just walk you through the three stages of the trial before Pilate. When they first bring Jesus to Pilate, and again, it's about 4:30 in the morning. And let me show you one other thing here. I can't resist. There is a gate on the western side of the modern city. And I have a picture up here. And in the top left-hand corner, this is the gate as it stands today. Now, the wall in front of you there, that's a very late 1546 Ottoman Turkish wall, Sultan's wall. But on the other hand, there are elements of that wall which are Herodian. And without getting deeply into it, and the man who has done the most work on this is named Shimon Gibson. He wrote a book called The Final Days of Jesus, and I recommend that book very cautiously, but this chapter on this is very helpful. And he dug this out carefully over many, many years and so on. And there is absolutely no doubt, let's put it that way. And by the way, through many of those years, Shimon Gibson's right-hand man, literally as it were, was my dear friend Joel Kramer. And he's the one, I've been here with Shimon at this site, but Joel Kramer, who knows it well and has gone through he's a better student of it than anybody in the face of the earth, I would say, even Shimon, for reasons I won't get into. But the point is, this is an ancient gate, and it would open into Herod's palace. And Herod was frustrated because he couldn't get directly into his palace. He had to go through the city. And so he determined to build, and Josephus tells us all about this, tells us about this gate and so on, tells us a lot of things that happened at this gate. And he says it was on the west side of the city of Jerusalem. And that's exactly where you are. If you go out, if you've been to Jerusalem, and you know this, that you go out to Jaffa Gate, just turn left and keep staying close to the wall all the way down, across a road, up a road, and you'll come to this spot right here. Now, these two were ancient. That's this right here. Ooh, why can't I write on that? Right here. So they were walls skirting a large stairway right here. And that stairway entered a gate system that had an outer wall right here, and then, of course, an inner wall. And he doesn't have it here, but you would pass through a gate, and to this day, there is evidence in this spot right up here, right here, there is evidence that there was a bema seat there, a judgment seat. And so, and these stones right here, and these are Herodian, they are actually bedrock, but they were carved all the way back in the days of Herod. Those are the steps going into this gate right here. So you can go here and stand and envision this remarkable scene. So, having said it, now I'm really in trouble, aren't I? Jesus is brought to Pilate. Let me take you back to the text. And Pilate goes out to the accusers. Remember, it's 4:30 in the morning. The city is still asleep. And he goes out and say, what's the accusation? And they reply, if he weren't an evildoer, we wouldn't have brought him. And Pilate says, he's not, well, then you take him and judge him according to your law. If you're not going to tell me what the accusation is, I'm the judge. And they say, you know that we can't do that because we can't put anyone to death. So now Pilate, and again, I think the Sanhedrinists are probably thinking, Pilate, you know what, our agents went to your agents, we made a deal, just send him to crucifixion, just announce him guilty. What are you talking about? And Pilate won't go along with it. And so Pilate, and I'm going to suggest something here, and I think I can make a case for it in the record. I think Pilate was something of a seeker. Certainly Pilate didn't live in a cave. He had heard, he must have known people who had been healed, for heaven's sakes. And his wife was evidently really interested in this innocent man, as she calls him. And so for whatever set of reasons, he's kind of interested. So he takes Jesus alone into the Praetorian. And now you have the first of two private interviews. I'm going to go through this very carefully, though it is one of my favorite scenes in the Gospels. But here it is, beginning in verse 33. He calls Jesus in and he says, are you the king of the Jews? Now, the interesting thing about this question is that it's hopelessly, cripplingly ambiguous. Think of the scene. Jesus is alone with Pilate in the Praetorium. It is 4:30 in the morning. Jesus by now is bruised and buffeted, and he's manacled. He's on trial as a seditionist. And the judge, and he's a judge who has every right to be a judge. Now, listen, let me tell you something. This is Roman law. In Roman law, you can, unless he's a citizen, you can interrogate the accused. Pilate's not doing anything untoward here. This is exactly what the Romans do. The Romans didn't have a protocol that you couldn't interrogate the accused unless he happened to be a citizen. Jesus was not a citizen. So the scene is that Jesus is on trial. He is standing before a legitimate judge. The judge has asked him, are you a king? And the problem is he might be asking, are you the Messiah of Israel? And of course, the answer to that is yes. Or he might be asking, are you a seditionist? And Jesus, again, had the Spirit enabled him to read Pilate's mind. He could have, but he didn't. And that is, the Spirit didn't. And so Jesus has to ask a question because he's jealous for the truth and he's not going to be careless about this. So Pilate says, are you a king? And Jesus says in verse 34, are you speaking for yourself about this? Or did others tell you this concerning me? Now, in none of this, don't find Jesus being snarky and uppity and contemptuous of Pilate. I think he's Romans 13ing this. He is acknowledging 1 Peter 2 that even those who are harsh, that's taskmasters. But the point is that he has a responsibility as a resident, if not a citizen of Rome. So the point is, Jesus simply asks, are you asking this out of your heart? Are you speaking for yourself? Or are you asking me about what others have accused me of? Well, Pilate answers in verse 35, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered to me. What have you done? So now there's no doubt about what is at stake. He is asking, you are accused of sedition. Are you guilty? Are you a seditionist? What have you done? You've been delivered to me as a judge. I need to know, are you guilty? Now, I could stop here for a long time, but I'm going to be very quick. But this is one of the turning points in this whole drama, the turning point in this drama in many ways, because Jesus answered and he said, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here, does not come in this way. Now, I will say that this verse is put to a lot of what I think is mischief. And there are many replacement theologies who insist that Jesus came to redefine the kingdom, and so they love to go to this verse. I like to say, and I really am being a little flip here, but I'm not being unloving. I have a lot of dear friends who would embrace some level of replacement theology. I think they're wrong. I think they're dead wrong. But I always say that if a replacement theologian accidentally drops his Bible, it's probably going to flop open to this verse, because this is their verse. My kingdom is not of this world. All right, now let's stop. Jesus is on trial for his life. It's 4:30 in the morning. He is alone with a Roman prefect. He has been asked a very legitimate question. Are you a seditionist? I don't think he's going to take the opportunity to deliver a one-sentence lecture on kingdom theology to Pilate that totally unsays everything the Old Testament ever said. I don't think that's what's going on. I don't think it makes sense. You've got to put it in its context. So what is he saying? Folks, watch this. This is so important. Realize this, that after this interview, Pilate is going to go out and for the first of 5 times say the man is guiltless. And throughout the entire hour-and-a-half episode, again and again, 5 distinguishable times, Pilate is going to say the man is innocent. Now, you have to ask yourself, and by the way, Pilate is going to insist on that against every influence and pressure, and he's going to put himself in, I think, political harm's way. I can prove that to you by refusing to crucify Jesus, but he is absolutely convinced. And he became, as Peter said, determined to let him go. Now, here is my question. In the terms of the narrative, how came Pilate to that persuasion? What is it that brought him to the place where he was so convinced that he would not back down, that this man was innocent? There's only one answer. It's that sentence right there. It's that verse. This is an airtight legal argument. And this is what's missed all the time. Put it in its context. What have you done? And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. And if you wonder what he means by of this world, it wouldn't hurt to read the next verse. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight. Now, Pilate didn't live in a cave. He knew what a sedition looked like in Israel. And everybody, every time there was a sedition, and some false Messiah would find himself some sort of a hideout, a fastness down in the wilderness by the Dead Sea, and he'd gather a militia, and he'd come out, and he'd fall on the Roman troops, and he'd fall on the Roman armories, and so on. And that's what a sedition looks like. You don't have a sedition without that. That's what a sedition is. And I think Pilate maybe stood there for a minute and stroked his Roman chin and said, you know what? This man has been going up and down the countryside for the better part of 3 years. I've had to follow this. He's been in and out of my territory. He's been all over Herod's territory. And you know what? He's got tens of thousands of followers, and not one of them has ever raised a hand against Rome. They're probably better citizens than they've ever been before. And I think he stood there and thought, the man's right. To argue that this man, with his record and the way he's handled himself through all of these years, to try and make the case that he's a seditionist, you'd have to be insane. And this argument, a simple but a legally airtight argument, totally convinced the judge. Now, what is stunning is in the next sentence, Pilate said, well, are you a king then? And what's stunning about this, it's there in verse 37, that has nothing to do with the judicial proceedings. But I think Pilate he's just asking. There is something in his heart. He says, well, are you a king? The Jews are talking about a coming king. I don't know. Are you a king? And let me tell you something. One of my favorite verses is Jesus' reply. I love it. Jesus was a premillennialist. He said, you say rightly that I'm a king. For this cause I was born, For this cause I've come into the world, that I should bear witness to this truth. Now, this is a definite article, the truth, but I think, I know that the definite article can at times, and often does, have demonstrative force, and I don't think he's talking about philosophically bear witness to all the truth. I think he's saying to this truth, I'm a king, and everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Well, Pilate says, what is truth? I don't think that's cynicism as much as it is exasperation, because now, take a moment, put yourself in the moment. Pilate has the hot potato of all time. This city is about to explode. And you got the Pharisees saying, the Sanhedrin saying, put him to death. You got the people in Pilate's mind saying, we love this man. And Pilate thinks, what am I going to? So I think he's just saying, oh my goodness, what is truth? But he goes out and he says, for the first of 5 times, he goes out and says, I find no fault in him at all. Go to that picture. I'm going to do it just for fun. New share. Go to this picture right here, and I'll make it big this way. So, Jesus, the Sanhedrinists had hauled Jesus into this area right here. Pilate is sitting on his bema seat up here. There are remnants of it to this day. Pilate takes Jesus in here and interviews him and throws his hands in the air, comes out. Jesus is probably standing in the place of the accused. I picture Pilate going back up to his bema seat. All the accusers are gathered all around here, and they're breathlessly waiting. And Pilate goes up to his bema seat, and he stands there and he announces this: I find no fault in him at all. Oh. Now again, this is just, the city is still pretty much asleep. But his accusers, Jesus would have just erupted. What are you talking about? And they did. And I'll just tell you very quickly the second stage. Because what happens is that they say, this man is a rabble-rouser. By the way, I did not read to you. Shame on me. Oh, I'm in such trouble, aren't I? Are you still with me? I can't blame you if you're not. But let me take you to Luke 13 just real quickly, because Luke 13 really gives explicit expression to the charge. This is what Jesus had been charged with. Not Luke 13, for heaven's sakes. Luke 22. Now I've made a mess. Luke, it's got to be 22. No, it's not 22. It's 23. It's 23. All right. Brain burp. All right. So this is what I want you to see. Here it is right here. 23:1. The whole multitude, these are his accusers, the Sanhedrinists, who had gotten him to confess, Jesus, to confess that he was the Christ. They wrote and led him to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, all these, and saying that he himself is Christ, the king. Now this is their big strategy. And so Pilate, what are you going to do with this? And so now Pilate goes in and he says, are you a king? What do you mean? What have you done? My kingdom is not of this world. You have nothing to worry about. There's every evidence that I'm not mounting a sedition. And then Pilate, after asking, well, are you a king, and getting Jesus' magisterial answer, goes back out and says, I find no fault in him. Well, when he said that, they began to erupt. They began to say, no, he's been guilty. And so right here it is. They were the more fierce, saying, these are Jesus' accusers. He stirs up the people, teaching throughout the Judea, beginning from Galilee. And very quickly, when Pilate heard the word Galilee right here, he realized, oh, I don't want to do that. He realized, oh, he's a Galilean, and that's not even my jurisdiction. Maybe I can get off from this. And Herod Antipas, who ruled in Galilee, was also in town. And I would argue that Herod was probably staying in Herod's palace, because now, again, I'm concerned about the time constraints. And if you have Jesus being hauled off to Herod and then hauled back across the city, I don't think you need that. And there's no place that's ever been identified where they're confident that Herod would have stayed. But think about this. This place on our map we're calling Herod's Palace. Well, it's called Herod's Palace. I'll go back to the map real quickly. This huge 1/5 of a mile long installation high on the Western Hill is Herod's Palace. Who is Herod that built that? Herod's Palace. It's Herod the Great. He built it. He lived there. Well, who is Herod Antipas? He's Herod's son. So he undoubtedly had, this is a fifth of a mile long. It's massive. Not all building, courtyards and pools and fountains and so on. But the point is, Herod Antipas, as Herod the Great's son, whose home this was, undoubtedly had quarters here. So I think when he comes back to town, he probably goes back to I think he may have had the same posters on the wall, I like to say. So I think Herod is right there. So here you are on the outside of Herod's palace at that gate that I just described to you. That's where Jesus is brought by the Sanhedrinists. And now when Pilate hears the word Galilee, he can send Jesus just across the courtyard. And what happens with Herod Antipas is he wants to see a miracle, and Jesus remains absolutely mute. And finally, Herod grows weary of it, sends him back. So now he is back, and this would be the third stage of the trial before Pontius Pilate, and that is before Pontius Pilate, then to Herod Antipas, and then back to Pontius Pilate. But let me take you back to John, and because this is what happens. He is brought back to Pontius Pilate, and it's right here. This is what happens. It's not all here, but I was going to take you to the synoptics as well, but I'm so over time, but I want to be done. So Jesus is brought back to Pilate, and in the meanwhile, Pilate has sat up there on that bema seat. And this gate that I'm showing you is very accessible. It's above the Hinnom Valley, and thousands of people could gather outside that gate, and often did. And Josephus has accounts where that happens. So I think, again, Pilate is waiting. He's hoping that maybe but he thinks this is probably not going to work. And he's sitting up here on his bema seat. And he looks out, and by now the city begins to wake up. Because, again, with what wildfire speed the report must have circulated through that overcrowded city that this one whom we welcomed on Sunday is now on trial for his life before Pontius Pilate. And so people begin to come. And I think Pilate looks out over the wall there, and he sees those people, and he says, I got an idea. I know what I'll do. We have a custom. And we release at Passover one prisoner, just to kind of release a little bit of pressure, because it's such a pressure-packed time. So it's our custom to kind of buy some favor, and we've kind of decided on Barabbas, but given Sunday and Monday and Tuesday, they probably would have. So he says, I know what I'll do. I'll offer them Jesus. So here come the Sanhedrinists. They bring him back from Herod Antipas, and again they're appealing to Pilate to just send him and crucify him. And Pilate looks at him, and I think he probably, with a bit of a glimmer in his eye, perhaps he's come up with a pretty good plan. He begins to address the multitudes, and you can. It's often done in the stories in Josephus. So he addresses the multitudes. Excuse me, you know it's Passover. We were going to give you Barabbas, but let me make you an offer. Who would you have me give you, Jesus or Barabbas? And I think Pilate is confident he's come up with a way to go over their heads and say, I'm sorry, guys, what could the people ask for Jesus? And he could release Jesus and be done with this. And defuse this horribly incendiary situation. And to his shock and dismay, the people say, give us Barabbas. Now the Bible is explicit that the chief priests persuaded the people. And I think you can take that dynamic and extrapolate over the whole sorry drama. That it was the leaders who were, but the people were really, they were indebted to the leaders. And so their minds were manipulatable. And so, but the point is that the Barabbas trick fails. And so I think that's Pilate's strategy to maybe be able to release Jesus. So now he takes Jesus in and scourges him. And it's cruel. I don't think it's angry. I think it's a cruel kindness, because quite clearly, and this is told, the scourging is in the synoptics, but John gives us this scene in John 19. It says he scourged him. The soldiers took that crown of thorns, put on a cheap purple robe to hail the King of the Jews. That's the soldiers, struck him with their hands. But watch this. Pilate then went out again and said, behold, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no fault in him. That's the context. You got to know this man is innocent. But he brings him out and stands him before the crowd and says in verse 5, behold the man. So understand the scene. Jesus is brought out. I think he's probably taken inside the Praetorian. There was a rather luxurious barracks for the Praetorian Guard, the crack soldiers who guarded, first of all, Herod and then others after him. But and there was probably a scourging station there, a punishing station. So very possible, we don't know, he's probably inside. But now he's brought out, he's bloodied beyond what you can imagine and so on. And Pilate stands there and probably stands right next to him and says, "Behold the man." You hear what he's saying? Have you had enough? You're telling me this man is a threat to Rome? Even the scourging seems to, everything in the record would suggest that it was an attempt on, and I think this is what perhaps Peter has most in mind when he says he was determined to let him go. He took huge steps to let him go, and you wouldn't. Well, now to finish the story, and I'm egregiously long, but what happens is that, well, I better take you back to the scriptures, that Pilate once again says, when he says, "Behold the man," there in verse 5, they say in verse 6, "Crucify him." And Pilate says, "I'm not going to, you take him and crucify him." And here's the fifth time, "I find no fault in him. The man is innocent. This is crazy. He's not going to die as a sedition." That's what he's saying. Then the Jews say this, and so much turns on this. We have a law. This is our accusers. And I don't think they're saying this with veins popping out of their necks. I think they're saying it in somewhat reasoned fashion. Look, Pilate, we have a law. And if you're not going to crucify him as a seditionist, according to our law, he has to die because he made himself the Son of God. That's why Jesus died. Now, I'm going to come back to this on Sunday, but let me just say what happens is when Pilate's right in verse 8, when Pilate heard that, he was more afraid. Oh my goodness, he claims to be the Son. I don't need to hear this. And he went again. And I love this scene. I'll be quick with it. This is the second time that Jesus is taken alone into the Praetorium. Right here in verse 8 or verse 9, he went again into the Praetorium. So he's inside, just him and Jesus. And watch this narrative, this conversation. He said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" And I think he's saying, "Who are you? This is crazy. They welcome me as king on Sunday. They love you. And now today, no matter what I do, I can't satiate their bloodthirsty. They say, 'Crucify him.' Who in the world are you?" Jesus won't answer. And finally, Pilate says in verse 10, "Are you not speaking to me? Don't you know that I have the power, the authority to crucify you and the power to release you?" Now, at this point, I'm going to give a reading to the next verse that is probably different than what you've heard in the past. I think I can defend it. I think it makes so much more sense and honors who Jesus was so much carefully. But when he said, "Don't you know I have a power?" Jesus answered and said, "You would have no power. You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you," that's Caiaphas, "has the greater sin." Now, the point is that this phrase right here, "has been given you from above," is probably most often taken to be a reference to God in heaven. In which case, Jesus is saying, and I think he'd be kind of patting Pilate on the head here, if you know what I'm saying. Come on, Pilate. You wouldn't have any authority at all if my Father in heaven hadn't given it to you. Now, that's a possible reading of that, but it doesn't fit what's going on here. And if that's the case, I cannot make any sense of the next phrase where he says, "Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." In other words, Pilate, you'd have no authority at all. Don't take too much to yourself. You're only there because my Father put you there. Therefore, Caiaphas is the greatest sinner. How does that follow? I would argue with many, this is not unusual, that the phrase "given you from above" is a reference to the Roman authorities who had assigned Pilate this jurisdiction. And I think Jesus is saying, Pilate, and I'll back up one. I don't think Pilate is getting mad at Jesus in verse 10. I don't think he's saying, "You're not going to speak to me. Do you realize how important it is? I have authority to." I think what he's saying is, "Are you going to speak to me? You're not going to help me here? Don't you realize I've been given the authority? I got to make a choice. I'm going to either crucify you or I'm going to set you free. Will you help me here?" I think that's what Pilate is saying. And Jesus says, "Pilate." I like to picture Jesus, and this is really my imagination going wild. But I like to picture Jesus perhaps with the blood and the shackles and the crown, maybe just stepping forward and putting his hands on Pilate's shoulder and looking him in the eyes and saying, "Pilate, you'd have no authority whatever, except you were assigned this jurisdiction." Do you hear what he's saying? You didn't hunt me down. This is not your fight. You wouldn't even be here, except for the providential reality that you were assigned this jurisdiction by those above you. Now it makes all the sense in the world for him to say, therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. The real wicked culprit here is Caiaphas. I think that's what Jesus is saying to Pilate. I think he's saying it lovingly. But we still have a question, and that is, what is he telling Pilate? All right, hold on to your seats, come up. This is just my suggestion. It's what I believe, but maybe you can come up with a better reading. I think Jesus is giving Pilate permission to go ahead. I think you got to put yourself in the moment. Jesus has to go to the cross. Pilate has a role to play. He has exhibited a reserve of character that many might not have expected of him. And he is absolutely determined by Peter's testimony not to deliver Jesus to the cross. And yet he's got to go to the cross. Jesus has to. And I think Jesus is saying, Pilate, I don't think he's excusing him morally, but I think he's saying, Pilate, this is not your fight. Now what happens is, the next verse says, Pilate sought the more to release him. He went out and worked harder to release him. Folks, find some sort of cynical, angry monster in this man. I don't see it in the record. He's worked so hard to deliver Jesus. And now even he goes out and the Jews play their trump card, the Jewish accusers now. And they say, if you don't crucify him, we're going to tell Caesar. And Pilate had used up all of his coupons back in Caesar. He was a bit of a crippled ruler. And I'm sure that played a big part in the next step. But I think in the back of his mind, Pilate is remembering that Jesus had quietly, kindly, privately said to him, this is not your fight. The real culprit is Caiaphas. So for whatever set of reasons, he makes his way back up, and I like to picture it this way. And the synoptics tell us, of course, that he calls for a basin of water and a rag. And I like to picture Pilate, Jesus standing here, bloodied by this time. They both come out. So Pilate comes out, tries to release him. The Jews say, we're going to tell Caesar. So Pilate, perhaps with slumped shoulders, makes his way up these steps, takes his seat, calls for a basin. Very ceremonial, he stands there and washes his hands for everybody to see. And then I picture him perhaps walking back down those steps, walking into the gate, maybe taking that rag and handing it to one of the soldiers. And as he goes in, looking back over his shoulder and saying, you do with him what you will. Now, at this point, Jesus is turned over to be crucified. There's one more part to the story I'm going to give you, and I think it can be done under 2 hours. That's really, but it's a story that deserves to be told, and it'll be recorded, and I trust you'll be able to access it again if the Spirit compels you to do so. But let me just take you to John once again, because there's an addendum to the story. And I'm going to go about 1 o'clock this afternoon, and because I don't want to bump too much into church services. And I know most of you won't be able to be with me, but I am going to go live and deal with the crucifixion itself. But what happens is that Jesus is sent off to be crucified. And we're told in John 19 that Pilate caused a title. Now understand that crucifixion had been fine-tuned by the Roman government. And it was a means of dealing with sedition. Primarily, it was about putting down rebellions. And it was not, crucifixion itself was not primarily about executing the seditionists. It was about putting down the sedition. And so it was surrounded, and we'll talk about this in the next session, it was surrounded with all sorts of protocols. And one of them, it wasn't ironclad evidently, but one very standard practice was to affix a titulus, it's called, a title, somewhere on the cross, and I think it probably was a T-shaped cross, and so above the head of the victim, and it would identify as crime, and especially if it was sedition, because Pilate, the Roman government wanted not only to execute the seditionists, but to make everybody who saw it understand, don't raise your hand against Rome. This is where you're headed. But Pilate caused a banner to be written which said, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And you know, and when some of the Jewish leadership here in verse 20 saw that, they came to Pilate and they said, and they saw that it was near the city, so everybody's going to see it, and it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, folks. Pilate didn't have to do that. He wrote it in probably Aramaic and Greek and Latin, the tongue of the Jews and the tongue of the tradesmen and the tongue of the officials. He wanted everybody to see this. This is stunning. And they came to Pilate and they said, don't write the King of the Jews, but he said, I am the King of the Jews. In other words, he's a seditionist. Don't say he's the King of the Jews, say he was a seditionist. And Pilate nobly says, what I have written, I have written. Now, it's that most makes me wonder if Pilate we're not going to meet him in the next life, because he didn't have to give this confession. And I can't help but connect this to what Jesus had said in answer to that private question when Pilate, for some reason, had said, well, are you a king? And Jesus said, you say rightly that I'm a king. It was for this purpose that I came into the world, to bear witness to this truth, that I am the king, and anyone who is of the truth is going to hear my voice. And I think Pilate is perhaps confessing here, I want to be of the truth. And so he puts his life and his career on the line, and he says, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Jesus, Paul says, press yourself into the mold. And when you study Jesus before Pilate, you realize that number one, he loved the truth because he was so careful. What do you mean, Pilate? Tell me, are you asking me about yourself? And he certainly loved what the Father had for him. That is, he was determined to go to the cross. And I think that's why he interacts as he does. But I'll tell you something else about Jesus that hops off the page. If you read it, I think, and don't bring some angry, brutal, thug citizen, cynic characteristic to Pilate. Just read it for what it says. I think the other remarkably important reality is Jesus loved Pilate. And I don't think we want to find Jesus handling himself with contempt, or I think Jesus carefully, and I think he made such an impact on Pilate. I think Pilate was already a bit of a seeker, but now Pilate confesses Jesus of Nazareth. Think about the fact that as Jesus hung on that cross, everybody in the crowd was confronted with the testimony of the judge. This man is what he claims to be. It's stunning. Well, I've gone a full 2 hours, and I apologize for that. I'm not, you know, I'm not sorry enough to repent. Let's put it that way. But I trusted some help, and I am going to pick it up this afternoon. And I think I will go at 1 o'clock. I think I can be ready at 1 o'clock, and I'll go live. But I know there won't be many to attend. But I trust it'll be there for you, because it's very, very important to tell the story, I think, is in its fullness. So again, God bless you. Thank you so much for the time, and God bless you on this very, very special day in the Christian calendar.